Welcome to Midnight Chronicles, where the darkest stories come to life just before you drift to sleep. Let us know what part of the world are you watching this from and at what time. Tonight, we'll take you on a journey through the strange, dark, mysterious, and the terrifying. That's what this channel is all about, and if you are into these kind of stuff, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We post fresh new content 3 to 4 times a week. Now, let's begin with today's story.
I've been renting this apartment for 4 years now. It's nothing glamorous, just a mid-range unit in a mid-rise building at the edge of downtown. But it's home, the kind of place where the scuffs on the hallway walls and the occasional elevator breakdown feel like part of the charm. The building sits on the corner of Greenfield and Taylor, wedged between a gas station and a boutique fitness studio. From my balcony on the 3rd floor, I can see the tops of the newer high-rises glinting in the sun, reminders of the parts of the city I'll probably never afford to live in. Mornings here are predictable. My alarm goes off at 7:15, always followed by the clinking of spoons and mugs from the unit above mine. My upstairs neighbor, Clara, is a caffeine fiend. I've never actually met her. I only know her name from the mailroom, but I can practically set my watch by the sound of her making coffee. By 7:30, I'm in the kitchen, scrolling half-heartedly through the news while I wait for the kettle to boil. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingles with the faint scent of bleach from the hallway. The janitor, Miguel, always does his rounds early. It's the kind of routine that becomes invisible until something interrupts it. The first interruption was the smell. It wasn't strong at first, just a faint tang that drifted down the hallway outside my door. I noticed it as I was leaving for work one morning, fumbling with my bag while juggling my thermos of coffee. At first, I thought it was cleaning chemicals. Miguel was thorough, maybe too thorough, and I figured he'd been using some heavy-duty stuff on the carpets. But the smell didn't fade. It got sharper. By the end of the week, it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just chemical, it was something else. Metallic, almost, like rusted iron mixed with damp earth. The scent seemed strongest near Unit 316. I first noticed the smell about 2 weeks ago. It wasn't strong, just a faint, acrid tang that lingered in the hallway outside 316. At first, I thought Miguel, the janitor, had been cleaning with industrial-strength chemicals again. But the smell didn't go away. It clung to the air like smoke, sharp and metallic, with a hint of something I couldn't place. The strange thing was, I hadn't seen anyone move in. For years, 316 was just empty. A blank door on the 3rd floor that I passed every day without a second thought. I figured it was owned by the building or maybe rented out as a short-term corporate lease. When I asked Miguel about it once, he shrugged. "People come and go," he said, "but no one stays long." One evening, after a long day at work, I finally saw the new tenant. I was coming back from the gym, sweaty and sore, with my headphones in and a half-empty water bottle dangling from my hand. As I stepped out of the elevator, the smell hit me again, stronger this time. And there he was, standing in front of his unit with a grocery bag in one hand and a phone in the other. He looked normal enough at first glance. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. Average height, lean build. His dark hoodie and jeans were nondescript, the kind of thing you'd see on a dozen other people walking around the city. But something about him didn't feel right. It wasn't anything obvious, just a slight offness, like when you see a picture where the perspective is just a little skewed. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical, as he unlocked the door and stepped inside without acknowledging me. "Hi!" I tried, giving him a polite nod. He froze mid-step, his head turning toward me in a way that felt too slow, too deliberate. For a moment, he just stared, his face unreadable. Then, as if remembering how to act, he smiled. It wasn't a bad smile exactly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hi!" he said, his voice low and raspy, and then he disappeared, closing the door behind him. The next morning started like any other. My alarm dragged me out of a restless sleep, and I spent a good 15 minutes scrolling through my phone before I could convince myself to get up. By 8 o'clock, I was out the door, juggling my bag and travel mug as I headed for the elevator. The hallway was quiet as usual. No sign of the tenant in 316. But as I passed his door, I caught a faint sound coming from inside. It was rhythmic, like someone tapping on a surface with their knuckles, and it stopped abruptly as I walked by. Work was uneventful. Just another day of meetings, spreadsheets, and a marketing pitch for a tech company trying to sell a product no one really needs. I grabbed lunch at the sandwich shop near the office, spent an hour procrastinating on LinkedIn, and left at 6 o'clock feeling like I'd accomplished nothing. Back home, I made pasta for dinner and settled on the couch with my laptop, mindlessly scrolling through streaming options. The encounter from the night before was already fading from my mind, just another odd blip in the monotony of daily life. But then I started seeing him more often. At first, it was subtle. I'd catch a glimpse of him in the lobby, standing awkwardly near the mailboxes with a blank expression, like he couldn't remember what he was supposed to be doing. Or I'd see him leaving the building just as I was coming back, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were carefully rehearsing each step. Once, I ran into him at the cafe downstairs. He was standing at the counter, staring at the menu for an uncomfortably long time. The barista, Rachel, a college student who always worked the afternoon shift, looked visibly uncomfortable as she waited for him to order. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded off, too flat, like he was repeating words he'd memorized without understanding them. "Black coffee, please," he said. Rachel hesitated, then nodded and punched the order into the register. As he turned to leave, his eyes met mine. He paused, tilting his head slightly, as if trying to place me. "Hi," I said, forcing a smile. He smiled back, a little too wide, a little too slow. "Hi," he repeated, the words sounding unnatural in his mouth. And then he walked out, leaving me with a knot of unease in my stomach. After the cafe encounter, I couldn't stop thinking about him. The new tenant in 316. It wasn't just the smell or the odd stiffness in the way he moved. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite articulate. Like when you see a face in a crowd and instinctively know something is wrong, even if you can't pinpoint why. I started noticing him more often. Not enough to call it stalking, he wasn't following me, at least not that I could tell, but enough that it felt like he was always there. It was a Friday evening, and the city was winding down from the work week. I decided to skip cooking and treat myself to takeout, but first, I needed a few essentials from the grocery store down the block. The place was packed as usual. I grabbed a basket and made my way through the aisles, weaving between harried parents and couples debating which brand of pasta sauce to buy. I was in the produce section, debating whether to splurge on out-of-season blueberries, when I spotted him. He was standing by the apples, holding one in his hand like he'd never seen fruit before. His head tilted slightly as he turned it over, studying it from every angle. I tried to brush it off as a coincidence. Everyone shops for groceries, right? It wasn't weird for him to be here. But then he noticed me. His head snapped up too quickly, like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. For a moment, he just stared at me, his dark eyes unblinking. Then, as if remembering how to behave, he gave me that same strange, too wide smile. "Hi," he said. "Hey," I replied, my voice uncertain. He didn't move, just stood there, holding the apple, as if waiting for me to say something else. Nice to see you," I added awkwardly, and turned back to the blueberries. When I glanced back a few seconds later, he was gone. But as I made my way to the checkout, I noticed something strange. He wasn't buying anything. He was standing by the exit, empty-handed, staring out the automatic doors like he didn't know how they worked. As I passed him, he turned and gave me a small nod. It should have been nothing, a forgettable interaction in a busy grocery store. But the way he watched me, like he was studying me, left my skin crawling. The more I saw him, the harder it became to ignore the cracks in his act. Like the time I spotted him in the laundry room. It was late, almost midnight, and I'd gone down to switch my clothes to the dryer. He was standing by the folding table, staring at the rows of washers like he couldn't figure out what they were for. When I walked in, he straightened abruptly, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie. "Laundry day," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. He didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. Instead, he nodded once, stiffly, and said, "Yes, laundry." There was no basket, no detergent, no clothes in sight. I shrugged it off, tossing my wet clothes into a dryer and starting the cycle. But as I turned to leave, I caught him watching me again. His gaze wasn't exactly hostile, but it was too focused, too intense, like he was memorizing every move I made. "Have a good night," I said, forcing a smile. "You too," he replied, the words sounding off. Not rude, not sarcastic, just wrong. Another time, I ran into him in the elevator. It was early morning, and I was running late for work. My hair was still damp from the shower, and I was juggling my laptop bag, coffee, and phone as I stepped into the elevator. He was already inside, standing in the corner with his back to the doors. "Morning," I said automatically, glancing at him as I hit the button for the lobby. "Morning," he repeated, his voice flat. I tried not to stare, but something about the way he stood bothered me. He wasn't leaning against the wall or shifting his weight like most people do in elevators. He was perfectly still, his arms hanging straight at his sides, as if holding that position required effort. When the doors opened, I stepped out quickly, muttering a polite, "Have a good one." I expected him to stay behind. Maybe he was going to a different floor, but he followed me out. He didn't seem to be in a hurry. He didn't even seem to have a destination. He just walked behind me, his footsteps perfectly timed with mine, all the way to the building's front door. It wasn't until a week later that I finally mentioned him to Miguel. I'd run into the janitor in the lobby, where he was mopping the tile floor with his usual efficiency. "Hey, Miguel," I said casually. "Do you know much about the guy in 316? Miguel paused, leaning on the mop handle. "The tall guy?" he asked. "He moved in recently, right?" Miguel frowned. "Maybe a month ago. Weird guy. Doesn't talk much." "Why?" "Just curious," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "He's quiet, isn't he?" Miguel snorted. "Too quiet. Most people, you see them come and go, they say hi, they complain about the plumbing and whatnot. But him? He's different." "How so?" I asked. Miguel hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know, man. He gives me the creeps. Like he's pretending to be something he's not." The words sent a chill down my spine. Pretending. After my conversation with Miguel, I couldn't stop noticing the cracks. At first glance, the tenant in 316 seemed normal enough. If you didn't pay attention, he could almost pass for one of those introverted, slightly awkward people who preferred to keep to themselves. But once you saw him for what he was, or wasn't, it was impossible to unsee it. He wasn't bad at pretending. In fact, he was almost too good, like an actor who'd memorized all the lines but didn't understand the emotions behind them. One evening, I came home late after a long day at work. The building's lobby was mostly empty, except for him. He was sitting in one of the armchairs near the windows, staring out at the street. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was the way he was sitting, too straight, too still. Or maybe it was the fact that, for the first time, he wasn't wearing his usual hoodie and jeans. He'd dressed up, a button-down shirt, slacks, even a pair of polished shoes. The outfit should have looked fine, generic business casual, but on him it felt like a costume. "Hey," I said cautiously, pausing by the mailboxes. He turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto mine. "Hello. Waiting for someone?" I asked, nodding toward the empty chair across from him. "Yes," he said after a pause. "Hey, friend." His tone was flat, almost robotic, and something about the way he said friend made my skin crawl. I didn't know what else to say, so I forced a smile and turned back to the mailboxes. When I glanced over my shoulder a moment later, he was still staring at me. The next week, Clara, my upstairs neighbor, invited me to her birthday party. It It wasn't anything fancy, just a small gathering in her apartment with drinks, snacks, and a Spotify playlist. Clara knew everyone in the building, from the retired teacher on the first floor to the tech bro who kept a treadmill desk in his unit. "Hey," I asked casually as I poured myself a glass of wine. "What do you know about the guy in 316? Her face lit up. "Oh my God. The weird one?" I nodded. "I've seen him a couple times," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "He's so, I don't know, creepy, but in a subtle way, like he's trying too hard." "Exactly. I saw him in the parking lot last week, just standing there. I said hi, and he gave me this huge, fake-looking smile. It was like he'd practiced it in a mirror or something." I laughed nervously, but her words stuck with me. It was after that party that his behavior started to change. He wasn't just trying to blend in anymore. He was trying to engage. It started with small things. A nod in the hallway, a stiff hello in the elevator. Once, I saw him holding the door open for an elderly woman, but the way he did it was strange. Too precise, too rehearsed, like he'd studied a video on human manners and was following it step by step. Then he started asking questions. Simple ones at first, like, "How are you?" or "What time is it?" But the way he asked felt off. His tone was flat, his words slightly too formal, as if he didn't quite understand what he was saying. One evening, as I was locking my door, he appeared in the hallway. "Good evening," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Hey," I replied, keeping my tone light. "May I ask you a question?" Sure." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "What do people usually do on weekends?" The question caught me off guard. I guess it depends. Some people go out, some stay in. Watch movies, go to bars, that kind of thing." He nodded slowly, as if committing the answer to memory. "Thank you." Without another word, he turned and walked away. As the weeks went on, his attempts to blend in became more frequent and more unsettling. I'd see him at the cafe, sitting at a table with an untouched cup of coffee, pretending to scroll through his phone. But his finger didn't move naturally. It dragged too slowly across the screen, like he was mimicking a gesture he didn't quite understand. In the laundry room, he finally started doing laundry, or at least he tried to. He stood in front of the machines, holding a crumpled shirt, as if unsure whether to put it in the washer or the dryer. When I offered to help, he gave me that too wide smile and said, "I will figure it out, thank you." One night, I saw him in the parking lot. I'd gone down to grab something from my car, and he was standing near the dumpsters, staring at the sky. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. He turned to face me, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to respond. Then he said, "Beautiful night." It wasn't. It was cloudy and cold, with no stars in sight. But before I could reply, he added, "Do you ever feel wrong?" I froze. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head, his dark eyes studying me. "Like your body is not your own." The words sent a chill down my spine. No," I said quickly. "I can't say I have." He nodded, as if that answer satisfied him, and walked away without another word. The comment about feeling wrong lingered in my mind for days. Every time I passed 316, I couldn't help but feel like something, or someone, was watching me through the door. The metallic smell was stronger now, creeping into the hallway and clinging to the air like invisible mold. And his mimicry, it wasn't just unsettling anymore. It was falling apart. The first truly definitive sign came one evening as I was walking back from the convenience store. I was juggling a bag of groceries and my phone, texting Clara about trivia night plans, when I saw him ahead of me on the sidewalk. At first, I didn't think anything of it. He was walking in the same direction, his usual hoodie pulled over his head. But then I noticed the way he was walking. It was wrong. Not in an obvious way, it wasn't a limp or a stumble. It was something subtler, like he was trying to mimic the natural rhythm of a human stride but couldn't quite get it right. His steps were too measured, like he was counting each one in his head. Then he turned the corner, disappearing into the alley behind our building. I hesitated, my heart pounding. The alley was dark and usually empty at this hour. Why would he go that way? Against my better judgment, I followed. The alley smelled like rotting garbage, a sour tang that made my stomach turn. My footsteps echoed off the brick walls as I moved cautiously forward, scanning the shadows for any sign of him. And then I heard it, a low, wet sound, like someone tearing apart a piece of raw meat. I froze. The sound came from behind a dumpster, where the dim glow of a streetlight barely reached. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. The sound stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was only silence. Then he stepped into view. It was him, 316, but he wasn't alone. In his hands, he held what looked like a stray cat, its body limp and lifeless. Blood dripped from his fingers, staining the front of his hoodie. When he saw me, his face twisted into something that might have been a smile, but it was all wrong. Too wide, too toothy, like he was trying to stretch his face into an expression it wasn't meant to make. "Dinner," he said simply. I stumbled back, dropping my groceries. The sound of cans rolling across the pavement echoed in the alley. What the hell are you doing?" I stammered. His smile faltered, and for a moment, he looked confused, like he didn't understand the question. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing there, shaking. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the building felt like it was coming from 316. The next morning, I decided to set up a camera. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old webcam I'd had lying around, rigged to a motion sensor app on my laptop. I positioned it in the hallway outside my door, angled toward 316, and told myself it was just to ease my nerves. For the first couple of days, nothing happened. I went about my usual routine: work, gym, Netflix, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, on the third night, the motion sensor went off. I opened the app on my laptop, my hands shaking as I clicked on the recording. At first, all I saw was the empty hallway, lit by the soft glow of the overhead lights. Then, slowly, the door to 316 creaked open. He stepped out, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked on strings. He stood there for a moment, staring directly at the camera, his head tilted at an odd angle. Then he smiled. It wasn't a human smile. His lips stretched back too far, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth that didn't belong in any human mouth. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The next day, I avoided him. I left for work earlier than usual, took the stairs instead of the elevator, and made sure to keep my door locked at all times. But that evening, as I was heading back to my apartment, he was waiting for me. He was standing in the hallway outside 316, his hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm, almost cheerful. I tried to walk past him, but he stepped into my path. "You seem nervous," he said, tilting his head. "I'm fine," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned in closer, his dark eyes boring into mine. "You've been watching me." I froze. "Why?" he asked, his tone sharp, almost accusatory. I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered. His lips curled into that too wide smile, and for a moment, I thought he was going to lunge at me. But then he stepped back, his expression softening. "Have a good night," he said, and disappeared into his unit. The next morning, I found Miguel in the lobby, fixing a loose tile near the front desk. "Hey," I said, my voice low. "Do you still think there's something off about the guy in 316? Miguel glanced up, his brow furrowed. "Why?" I hesitated, debating whether to tell him about the alley, the camera, the smile. Finally, I said, "I think he's dangerous." Miguel's expression darkened. "I've been working here 10 years, he said. "Seen all kinds of weirdos. But him? I don't know what he is. I just know he's not one of us." After my conversation with Miguel, I was more certain than ever that something wasn't right about 316. But knowing something is wrong and doing something about it are two very different things. I wasn't brave enough to confront him directly, and honestly, I wasn't sure who'd even believe me if I tried to explain what I'd seen, so I did nothing. I went about my routine, keeping my head down and avoiding him whenever possible. For a while, it seemed to work. I didn't see him in the hallways or the elevator. The metallic smell that had been seeping out his unit faded. Life in the building started to feel normal again, or at least close enough to normal that I could almost convince myself I'd imagined the worst of it. Then, one night, everything changed. It was a little after midnight, and I was half asleep on the couch, a rerun of some old sitcom playing in the background, when I smelled it. Smoke. At first, I thought it was just a neighbor burning something in their kitchen. But then the fire alarm went off, shrill and urgent, cutting through the stillness of the night. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. "Fire!" Someone shouted from the hallway. "Get out!" Grabbing my coat and phone, I hurried out the door, joining the stream of tenants heading for the stairwell. The acrid smell of burning plastic filled the air, making my eyes water. As we filed out onto the street, I turned back to look at the building. Thick black smoke was pouring out of a window on the 3rd floor. It was 3:16. The fire department arrived quickly, their trucks flashing red and blue against the dark sky. Neighbors huddled together on the sidewalk, some in pajamas, others clutching pets or hastily grabbed belongings. I stood apart from the crowd, staring up at the flames, looking at the edges of 316. He wasn't outside. I scanned the faces in the crowd, looking for his tall frame, his hooded sweatshirt, that strange, too-wide smile. But he was nowhere to be seen. "Everyone accounted for?" A firefighter called out. The building manager, an older man named Frank, was checking names off a list. "We're missing one," he said, his voice tight. "The guy in 316. The firefighter nodded grimly and turned back toward the building. The fire was contained within an hour, but 316 was completely destroyed. When the firefighters finally let us back into the building, the hallway on the 3rd floor was blackened, the walls and ceiling scorched. The door to 316 hung open, its edges charred and splintered. I lingered outside it, hesitant to look inside. But curiosity got the better of me. The apartment was gutted. The walls were blackened, the floor covered in ash and debris. The metallic smell that had once clung to the air was gone, replaced by the acrid stench of smoke. There was no furniture, no personal belongings, nothing to suggest anyone had ever lived there. Over the next few days, rumors spread through the building. Some people said the fire was caused by faulty wiring. Others whispered about an explosion, something about chemicals or gas. But no one could explain what happened to the tenant. The fire department didn't find a body. There was no trace of him in the apartment. No clothes, no ID, not even a toothbrush. It was like he'd never existed. I tried asking Miguel if he'd seen anything, but he just shook his head. "That guy was bad news," he said. "Maybe the fire was his way of disappearing." "Disappearing?" I repeated. Miguel shrugged. "You know, covering his tracks." The idea made sense, but it didn't explain the things I'd seen. The way he moved like a puppet, the way he grinned, the teeth, the weird things he did. Just creepy stuff. Unexplainable. In the weeks that followed, life went back to normal. Mostly, the building repaired the damage, and a new tenant eventually moved into 316. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. Had he really been what I thought he was? Or had I let my imagination get the better of me? I started second-guessing myself, replaying the events in my head. The alley, the camera footage, the fire. Was there a rational explanation for all of it? Maybe he was just a strange, awkward guy who kept to himself. Maybe the metallic smell was from some kind of hobby, metalworking, or cleaning supplies. Maybe I'd misinterpreted his smile, his walk, his questions. Or maybe he wasn't human at all. I guess I'd never know. A month later, I was walking home from the grocery store when I saw him. At least, I think it was him. He was standing across the street, half hidden in the shadows of an alley. His hood was up, and his face was turned away, but something about his posture, too still, too rigid, made my stomach knot. I stopped, frozen in place, my pulse racing. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he turned, just enough for me to see the glint of his dark eyes. I blinked, and he was gone. I never saw him again after that. Sometimes I wonder if I made the whole thing up, if the stress of city life and late-night horror podcasts got to me. Other times, I'm sure he was real, that he was something else trying to pass for human. The fire destroyed any evidence that could have answered my questions, leaving nothing but ash and speculation. I'll probably never know the truth about 316, and maybe that's for the best.